Late summer, 1944, central Germany, just after dawn. A synthetic fuel complex sits in a shallow valley of smoke, its steel ribs still standing but no longer alive. Pipe racks are twisted like snapped bones. Cooling towers leak steam into the gray air. In the bomb craters beside the rail spur, black water shivers with a thin rainbow sheen. Oil that will never be refined, never be issued, never reach an engine. Inside the plant boundary, the war is suddenly quiet. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of machines that should be moving, but cannot. A refinery is not a single target. It is a chain. Power, hydrogen, pressure vessels, pumps, storage tanks, rail loading points. When the chain breaks in multiple places, production does not recover. It simply stops, and the stop spreads outward, into depots, into airfields, into armored parks, where engines are warmed and shut down again to save what little remains. By late 1944, Hitler can still demand offensives on maps. But fuel is no longer a matter of will. It is a matter of physics, chemistry, and time, none of which can be ordered into existence. Germany entered the Second World War with a weakness it could not confess in public and could never solve in private. It did not sit on an ocean of oil. The Reich had coal in abundance, and coal could be turned into fuel, but only through industrial alchemy on a vast scale. Hydrogenation plants and synthetic fuel works could produce aviation gasoline and motor fuels, but they required specialized machinery, steady power, trained crews, and uninterrupted transport. They were modern miracles built on fragile conditions. This was the hidden bargain behind German mechanized warfare. Blitzkrieg looked like speed and initiative, but speed is not a doctrine. It is a supply. Every panzer thrust, every truck convoy, every fighter sortie was an act of consumption. Early victories helped conceal the cost. Captured stocks, seized refineries, and access to foreign supply lines eased the pressure for a time. Romanian oil, shipped and refined through a vulnerable chain of railways, ports, and processing sites, became one of the most valuable lifelines Germany had. And because coal-to-liquid production existed at home, leadership could tell itself the situation was manageable, even as the system grew more brittle with every expansion of the front and every new demand from the air war. But the war did not stay short. By 1941 and 1942, Germany's choices made the fuel problem louder. The invasion of the Soviet Union multiplied distances, expanded the vehicle fleet, and raised the daily burn rate of the entire army. The drive toward the Caucasus in 1942 carried an oil logic inside it because leaders understood at a basic level that without fuel, modern war becomes a war of footsteps and horses. Yet even when Germany reached toward oil, it could not secure enough of it, and it could not protect the complex industrial web it already relied on. By the time the Reich faced sustained pressure on multiple fronts, fuel was no longer a background concern. It was the quiet governor on every decision, waiting for the moment an enemy with the reach and patience to target the system would finally strike the heart of it. That enemy reach begins to harden into a system in 1944, when the air war stops being only about factories and cities, and starts being about the one thing that makes every other weapon usable: refined fuel. For years, German production had leaned heavily on synthetic fuel, produced from coal in large hydrogenation and Fischer-Tropsch plants. These sites were not small, scattered workshops. They were industrial fortresses, complex, centralized, and dependent on steady electricity, water, skilled maintenance, and a constant flow of inputs and spare parts. They could be repaired after raids, sometimes astonishingly fast, but repeated attacks did something simple and irreversible. They forced the system into permanent triage. A plant could run at a fraction of capacity, then go dark again, then restart, then be hit again. Output stopped being a number. It became a rhythm of interruptions. In the spring and summer of 1944, Allied planners intensify raids against refineries and synthetic fuel plants because the logic is brutal and efficient. Destroying aircraft is expensive. Destroying the ability to fuel aircraft grounds them whether they are intact or not. And oil targets, especially processing and hydrogenation nodes, cannot be substituted the way some factories can. You cannot shift a refinery overnight. You cannot hide a hydrogenation plant in a forest. And even if a facility survives, transport becomes its own battlefield. Rail junctions, canals, tank cars, pumping stations, storage depots. Fuel that exists but cannot be moved is fuel that does not exist. Then, in August 1944, the Reich takes a strategic shock that no emergency decree can reverse. Romania changes sides, and with it, Germany's access to Romanian oil collapses. One of the few remaining large sources outside synthetic production is suddenly gone or contested, and the timing is lethal, because it arrives when the home synthetic network is already bleeding under sustained bombing pressure. Germany is left trying to fight a mechanized, air-powered war on dwindling domestic output that is itself being repeatedly disrupted. This is why the fuel collapse after 1944 is not a single event. It is a chain reaction. A pilot cannot train without aviation gasoline. A panzer division cannot maneuver without diesel and motor fuel. A rail network cannot function smoothly when locomotives, repair crews, and replacement parts are all competing with the front for priority. Even when weapons exist, and even when men remain, the war begins to shrink in one measurable way: range. How far units can move, how long they can stay active, how quickly they can respond. And once range collapses, every part of the German war effort starts to reveal what it truly is: a set of machines waiting for the one resource that can no longer reliably arrive. By late 1944, the fuel crisis is no longer an abstract shortage discussed in ministries. It becomes a daily humiliation felt at ground level by the people who keep machines alive. A Luftwaffe ground crew can service an aircraft perfectly and still watch it sit, chained to the earth by an empty Bowser. A driver can baby an engine, coast down slopes, and shut it off at every pause, because idling is waste, and waste is defeat. Mechanics strip damaged vehicles for usable parts not because they lack skill, but because moving new components across a bombed rail network begins to feel like fiction. For pilots, the loss is quieter but more final. Training hours shrink. Familiarity with a machine becomes partial. Instructors cannot afford repetition, the thing that turns theory into instinct. A young man can still be issued a uniform and a mission, but the invisible foundation beneath his confidence is thinner than it should be, and everyone around him knows it. In mess halls and dispersal pens, the talk changes. Not about whether the aircraft can fly, but whether it will be allowed to fly, whether there will be enough fuel for a scramble, enough reserves for a second sortie, enough margin to return if the weather shifts. Morale doesn't collapse in a single night. It erodes in small calculations until the war feels like a ration card. Fuel collapse turns modern formations into something older and weaker, static bodies guarding ground they can no longer shape. A panzer division is not its tanks alone. It is the ability to concentrate quickly, strike, disengage, and strike again. Without fuel, its strength becomes local. A commander can still hold a sector, but he cannot reliably rush reserves into a crisis, and he cannot promise the kind of operational surprise Germany once lived on. Plans begin to bend around fuel rather than around opportunity. Movements are delayed, shortened, rerouted, canceled. Armored units train less, drive less, and preserve their engines for the moment that matters, only to discover that the moment that matters arrives too often and too quickly. Even major offensives become hostage to the nearest depots and railheads. In the last year of the war, Germany's ability to act increasingly depends on fuel captured from the enemy or scraped together from emergency allocations, because the system that used to feed the front continuously is no longer dependable. And once the battlefield starts to obey the limits of the fuel ledger, the question shifts from how hard Germany will fight to something colder: whether Germany can still function as an industrial war machine at all. Germany's synthetic fuel program was a technical achievement built for a world where air power could not reach deep into the Reich every week. Coal hydrogenation and related processes could turn domestic resources into motor fuels and aviation gasoline, but only inside facilities that were complex in the most vulnerable way. They depended on continuous operation, high pressures, specialized compressors, delicate catalyst systems, vast pipe networks, power stations, water supply, and rail access all fused into one organism. A tank factory can sometimes keep producing if one hull is damaged. A synthetic fuel plant cannot improvise its way around a broken chain of pressure vessels, transformers, pumping stations, or control rooms. One major hit can halt output. Repeated hits turn maintenance into permanent emergency. And even repairs had a fuel cost of their own. Crews needed transport. Replacement parts needed rail lines. Skilled workers needed housing and food under bombardment. Electrical systems needed stable grids. When Allied raids struck the same complexes again and again, places like Luna, Merseburg, Politz, Blackhammer, and other key nodes, the result was not simply fewer barrels. It was a cycle of partial restarts, shutdowns, and redamage that made planning impossible. The Luftwaffe could still count aircraft on paper. What it could not count anymore was dependable aviation gasoline, delivered on time, in the quantities modern air operations require. Angle D. Leadership versus the enemy's logic. When the Allies target the bloodstream, by 1944, Allied air strategy increasingly reflects a cold understanding. If you break fuel, you break everything that moves. It is more decisive than chasing every tank or every aircraft individually. Long-range escort fighters and massed bomber forces allow deep strikes that Germany cannot reliably prevent, and the target sets become systemic: refining, synthetic production, storage, and transportation. The effect is strategic compression. German leaders are forced into allocation wars inside their own bureaucracy, arguing over fractions: how much to the army, how much to the Luftwaffe, how much to industry, while the total keeps shrinking. This is where Hitler's style of control meets a limit it cannot bully. Orders can compel men. They cannot refine crude that never arrives, or rebuild hydrogenation capacity fast enough under sustained attack, or make rail distribution reliable when junctions and bridges are being hammered. Even wonder weapons are trapped in the same equation. A jet grounded by training shortages and fuel scarcity is not a revolution, it is a monument. The Reich can still demand motion, but the war is increasingly decided by the side that can keep its engines turning, not in speeches, but in tonnage and throughput. And so, as 1944 closes, Germany reaches for the only remaining lever that seems to promise a reset. One more decisive operation designed to change the tempo before the fuel reality becomes absolute. December 1944 comes in with wet, cold, and low skies over the Ardennes, weather that muffles sound, slows aircraft, and gives the illusion that time can be bought. Inside German headquarters, the logic is no longer about building strength. It is about spending what is left in one concentrated motion before the accounts hit zero. The plan that becomes Walk am Rhein is shaped by fuel even when it pretends to be shaped by surprise. The objective is operational: break through the thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse, split Allied forces, and aim toward Antwerp. But the hidden requirement is simpler. The offensive must move fast enough to capture Allied fuel stocks before German stocks run out. That is not an embellishment. It is a structural dependency. A mechanized thrust, designed to live off the enemy's depots, is a gamble that admits, quietly, that Germany's own pipeline cannot sustain it. So the last weeks before the attack become a choreography of rationing. Vehicles are held back, movements minimized, engines preserved. Training is thin because training burns fuel that cannot be replaced. Formations assemble under forest cover and winter camouflage, but the concealment has another purpose. A stationary army consumes less than a moving one. On 16 December 1944, the offensive opens with artillery and assault in darkness and fog. In the first days it works, partly because the terrain channels defenders, partly because the weather grounds much of Allied tactical air power, and partly because surprise still has value in a war that has become predictable. American units are pushed back in places, road junctions become prizes, and the map briefly looks like it did in 1940. Arrows, thrusts, bold intent, but fuel is the silent hand on every throttle. As columns push into the Ardennes road net, congestion becomes its own enemy. A stalled truck is no longer a nuisance. It is a barrier that wastes precious hours of engine time behind it. Detours are not free. They burn the same dwindling reserves. Units that should exploit openings are forced to pause, not because the will to move is missing, but because movement has become conditional, dependent on a tanker arriving, on a captured dump being found intact, on a road remaining passable, on a bridge still standing. The offensive is still moving, still violent, still real. But beneath the battlefield noise, a more decisive rhythm is already asserting itself, the shrinking radius of what Germany can physically sustain. By the second week of the Ardennes offensive, the war's reality begins to show through the fog like dark ground under melting snow. German spearheads can still fight, still break small positions, still force local crises, but their forward motion starts to depend on events they cannot control, not enemy courage, not tactical brilliance, fuel. Some formations do seize supplies, but not at the scale required to feed an entire mechanized drive. Allied depots are moved, destroyed, or defended. Bridges are blown. Road junctions are contested. And every hour the offensive continues. Engines burn fuel whether they are advancing or stuck in traffic. Vehicles idle. Drivers inch forward. Tanks rev and stop and rev again on winter roads. This is not a dramatic collapse, like a front line breaking. It is something more humiliating. A high-technology army becoming slow. Then, the weather changes. Skies clear enough for Allied air power to return in force. And with it comes the one advantage Germany can no longer absorb: a mobile enemy that can see and strike moving columns. When fighter bombers begin cutting roads, burning trucks, and forcing dispersal, the fuel problem doubles. Columns break apart to survive air attack. Detours multiply. Deliveries fail. What reaches the front arrives late, in smaller amounts, or not at all. At the same time, the broader fuel system inside Germany is still bleeding. Synthetic plants and refineries have not recovered into stability. Rail lines remain damaged. Storage is vulnerable. Distribution is unreliable. So even as the Ardennes gamble consumes reserves at the front, the base cannot refill them at the rear. Germany is not just spending fuel. It is spending the ability to create fuel. When the offensive stalls, it reveals the turning point your title is built around. Hitler can still order a counterstroke. He can still demand another concentration, another defense line, another last stand. But he cannot restore the Reich's operational freedom, because operational freedom in mechanized war is the ability to move at will. And by early 1945, German movement is no longer a choice. It is a privilege granted by rare, temporary allocations. The Luftwaffe feels it with special cruelty. Aircraft can be built, dispersed, even protected in forests. But pilot training and sustained sorties are fuel-dependent at a scale that cannot be faked. Shortages reduce flight hours. Reduced flight hours reduce effectiveness. Reduced effectiveness increases losses. Increased losses demand more training, exactly what fuel shortage prevents. It becomes a closed trap. On the ground, the same physics takes hold. Armored reserves become increasingly local, committed close to where they sit because a long redeployment is too expensive. Retreats clog because trucks cannot shuttle supplies and wounded as freely as before. Repairs take longer because parts and fuel for recovery vehicles are missing. Germany's war becomes smaller, tighter, more cornered, not because the weapons disappear overnight, but because the bloodstream that connects them dries up. And from this point on, the end is not a mystery of strategy. It is a matter of exhaustion, measured in empty tanks, silent airfields, and divisions that can no longer do what divisions are meant to do. After the Ardennes, the fuel crisis stops being a background explanation and becomes a daily operational verdict. The German war effort continues, but it does so on a rationed heartbeat. Commands issue orders that assume mobility, then rewrite them around what the fuel situation allows. Frontline units hoard what they receive because resupply is uncertain and tomorrow is not guaranteed. The Luftwaffe's decline becomes even more visible. Sorties that once happened in waves become scarce and irregular. Training pipelines thin further, not only because airfields and instructors are under pressure, but because every training hour competes directly with combat needs for aviation gasoline. A pilot's experience, so hard to build, so easy to lose, cannot be manufactured by decree. As Allied air power tightens its grip, Germany is forced to fight under an increasingly permanent umbrella of enemy observation and attack, while its own response becomes sporadic. On the ground, armored operations narrow, tanks and assault. Guns are kept for emergencies, committed in short bursts, then pulled back to conserve. Recovery of damaged vehicles becomes harder when fuel for towing and transport is scarce. Retreats become more chaotic when truck lift is limited, and as rail networks remain disrupted, fuel distribution becomes a patchwork of local improvisation, vulnerable to interruption at every junction. Even where German units fight effectively, the larger machine behind them is no longer able to sustain the pace of modern war. It can defend for a time, it can bleed the enemy, but it cannot rebuild momentum. Into 1945, the fuel collapse turns Germany's strategic situation into something rigid and irreversible. A state can still draft men. It can still manufacture weapons in dispersed workshops. It can still move paper units on paper maps. But it cannot conjure the one resource that makes mechanized force behave like mechanized force. Without steady fuel, the Reich loses the ability to shift reserves, to counter breakthroughs quickly, to keep airfields active, and to protect its own movement from an enemy that now owns the sky. This is what Hitler can no longer fix, not morale alone, not discipline alone, not even production alone. Because fuel is not only a quantity, it is a system of extraction, refining, transport, storage, and distribution, each step vulnerable, each step dependent on the others. By late 1944 and early 1945, that system has been struck so often, in so many places, that recovery becomes mathematically implausible within the remaining time. Repairs can bring back fragments of capacity. They cannot restore reliability. As the fronts compress, Germany's choices become narrower and more desperate. Counterattacks become short-range and costly. Air defense becomes reactive rather than controlling. The last reserves are committed again and again, but each commitment burns fuel that cannot be replaced, and each loss reduces the ability to operate at all. The war ends with weapons still in hands, but with a nation increasingly unable to move those hands where it needs them. And in that final phase, the collapse of fuel is not just an economic story or an industrial story. It is the story of modern warfare's hidden rule. The side that cannot keep its machines moving is forced to fight on the enemy's schedule, in the enemy's chosen places, until there is nowhere left to maneuver. The fuel collapse after 1944 is one of the clearest reminders that modern war is not ultimately decided by slogans or even by individual weapons, but by the invisible systems that make those weapons usable. Germany still had designs, factories, engineers, and orders. It still had formations that looked formidable on paper. But once the flow of refined fuel became unreliable, once synthetic plants were repeatedly shattered, transport grids fractured, and external supply streams vanished, power turned into theater. A tank without fuel is not a threat. A fighter without training hours is not an answer. An offensive without reserves is only a way to spend what remains a little faster. Hitler could demand loyalty and sacrifice. He could punish failure and reward obedience. But no amount of coercion could change the chemistry inside a refinery, or the time required to rebuild a pressure vessel, or the reality that every mile moved is fuel burned forever. The Reich's defeat, in that sense, is also a lesson about industrial warfare itself. The decisive front is often not the one drawn on a map, but the one that runs through pipelines, rail lines, storage depots, turbines, and repair crews working under smoke. When fuel collapses, the future collapses with it. And in 1944 to 45, Germany learned too late that you can still fight fiercely and still lose the ability to choose how the fighting happens.